Welcome to the Local News Matters podcast, where we explore pathways to stronger journalism, better businesses, and healthier communities. I'm Tim Morgan-Porter, CEO of the Colorado Press Association. And in each episode, I sit down with guests from newsrooms and others in the local news ecosystem to highlight the innovative work of local newsrooms and those that support them, as well as the crucial questions they face. This episode, we are bringing you an episode from another excellent podcast covering the local news industry. From Northeastern University's School of Journalism, What Works? The Future of Local News is hosted by former Boston Globe editor Ellen Clegg and Northeastern's Dan Kennedy. They talk to journalists, policymakers, and entrepreneurs, and their conversations are always enlightening. In this episode, they talk to Linday Shapley of Colorado Community Media. CCM made national news a couple of years ago as the first investment by the National Trust for Local News. Given my position at the Colorado Press Association, our work with CCM, and more importantly, the important work they've been doing in their communities, I had a special interest in this conversation and think it deserves amplification. If you enjoy this episode, you can follow What Works at whatworks.news. And of course, you can follow the Local News Matters podcast at lnmpod.com. And now, here's Linday Shapley on episode 57 of What Works? The Future of Local News.
Welcome to What Works, a podcast about the future of local news, coming to you from Northeastern University's School of Journalism. I'm Dan Kennedy.
And I'm Ellen Clegg. Today we're talking with Linday Shapley, publisher of Colorado Community Media. Dan, you've written extensively about CCM, so I'm hoping you'll fill our listeners in. But before taking this current job, Shapley was at Colorado Politics, one of Colorado billionaire Philip Anschutz's holdings, and she previously worked for 21 years for the Denver Post. At the Post, she rose from being a copy editor and page designer to become managing editor and director of news operations. And I love what she told you, Dan, about her job as publisher. She said, quote, "I've been a lieutenant for a lot of really great generals. This is my opportunity to be a general," end quote. She's also talked about the power of representation as a visible Latina leader in an industry that has traditionally been dominated by white men. She says she hopes to use her position to encourage more diversity in journalism.
Ellen, I talked to Shapley when I was out in Colorado reporting on the media landscape that has come into view after severe cutbacks at the Denver Post under the ownership of Alden Global Capital. CCM publishes a couple of dozen weekly and monthly newspapers in Denver's suburbs. The company was purchased by the nonprofit National Trust for Local News in collaboration with locally based media organizations. A new public benefit corporation, the Colorado News Conservancy, was set up to run CCM, to be owned jointly by the National Trust and the all-digital Colorado Sun, which helps with operations.
Shapley was elevated at the Denver Post by Greg Moore, who's been a podcast guest on What Works. We'll put a link to our interview with Greg in our show notes. It's a great one. As the Post's newsroom shrank, Shapley took on just about everything. She directed news coverage and also attended to the many operational details of running a newsroom. And by the by, she has also been on the board of the Denver Press Club.
Shapley grew up in northeastern Colorado in a rural county. Her father had a dairy farm. She told me that dairy farming is a lot like newspapers because cows don't know it's Christmas. She had the journalism bug from an early age and was editor of her high school paper.
Later on in the podcast, I'll have a quick take about retired journalists who are busy launching startup newsrooms. Neiman Reports has a good piece by John Marcus that looks at the Asheville Watchdog in North Carolina and the New Bedford Light in Massachusetts. These journalists say they want to help bolster the profession that they gave their lives to by setting up nonprofit community news sites and mentoring younger reporters and editors. They aren't exactly playing pickleball.
We're in a Colorado state of mind this week, Alan. My quick take is going to be on the 5th anniversary of the Denver Rebellion, when the staff of the Denver Post rose up against further newsroom cuts being imposed by its hedge fund owner, Alden Global Capital. That rebellion sparked a revolution in Denver journalism. But now let's hear from Linday Shapley. Linda, when I interviewed you back in September of 2021, you had only recently been named publisher of Colorado Community Media. CCM was a chain of 24 locally owned weekly and monthly newspapers that had just been acquired by a coalition led by the National Trust for Local News, a nonprofit. CCM was converted to a public benefit corporation and is now owned by the Colorado News Conservancy, a partnership between the National Trust and the Colorado Sun, a digital startup. Now, you know all that, obviously. I'm just running it down for the benefit of our listeners. Anyway, you had quite a challenge. You told me in particular that you were hoping to push your papers in a more digital direction without alienating print readers and advertisers, and that you also had plans to grow. So what can you give us for a progress report?
Thanks, Dan. It's funny because change often in this kind of environment, it just seems to happen so slowly. I come from a world where it's kind of like, okay, we've got this big thing, it's breaking now, and we got to do it today. And certainly, that we're making steps in that way. And I think probably the biggest way that we've made the digital efforts happen is through newsletters. When I started at CCM, I think there was always kind of some discussion that we should be doing a newsletter. What does it look like? All this kind of stuff. I'm like, let's just get something out there to start with to see what the appetite is, how we can keep moving forward. So we have just kind of a real basic newsletter that goes to 7 of our markets right now. We've got them essentially, we've got 3 primary regions in the north, south, and west. And we have 2 newsletters in each region, and then a third from Littleton, which we had done kind of like a deeper dive where we kind of like learned more about the community, held focus groups, held a town hall, and issued a survey and told people, here's what Littleton readers really want. So we thought, you know what, this is a great opportunity for us to kind of build on that. So we have an additional newsletter in that, and that was, through the funding efforts of a foundation that's based in Littleton. And so with those 7 newsletters, we're like, okay, we can start to engage with our readers in a different way and see how they're accepting it. And, it's been great to kind of watch that progress. And so, we have a dozen other markets that we could be putting newsletters in. We're kind of turning a little bit and taking a couple of those basic newsletters that just kind of talk about, hey, here's what's in your e-edition this week, and are trying to turn them into something more of what we're doing in Littleton, of like having more of a conversation with our readers. I think one of the biggest things that we've learned throughout, this past year is that it's all about like, what are the connections that we can make within our communities, and that those connections help drive the audience support and the audience engagement that we need in order to kind of build our news operation. And that if we can find that support, it doesn't necessarily need to be in print. We recognize that, I think our newsletter right now goes to like 1.5% of the households in Highlands Ranch, for example. And we need to get that up higher, 10%, 15%. And like, what can we do in order to keep moving ahead in that way? So that's where we're kind of putting a lot of our energy right now. But one of the things that I think is really critical is the fact that, we're doing this in an environment where we want people to understand this is how we keep our community strong. This is how we keep democracy strong. And that, if we can get people to understand that really foundational, this is how we build and this is how we support, then we feel like that'll be the thing that will pay off for us. And so we need more reporters, we need more journalists, we need more people who are on the ground being able to pay attention to that.
When the National Trust for Local News led the buyout of these papers in the spring of 2021, it was pretty widely reported that the papers would be managed by the Colorado Sun. My understanding is that that relationship has evolved over time and is a little bit different from the way it was first described. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about the direction that that relationship has taken.
Sure. I would say that, the Colorado Sun is more of an operating partner, for lack of a better term. It's more of a advisory role, which serves us both, I think, greatly, is that we have some opportunities for the Sun where if they want to get out in front of a particular audience, we work on trade deals so that they can advertise in our papers, across the market, that sort of thing. And so that helps them reach people who may have otherwise not heard of them. So there's that in terms of what we can do for them, is to help bring their message, obviously, to a particular demographic that perhaps isn't as digitally nimble as a number of Sun readers are. Although, obviously that audience is becoming less apparent in the market. For us, where the real benefit is in the opportunity for the Sun to support us in a, with helping us get our words out. The Sun at the beginning of the year helped put forth a fundraising campaign that went for us. So then that way they've got it set up on their site. It's, that has a lot more technologically, they have a much more modern system for taking in donations, for taking in that sort of, or helping build our audience in that way online. That's an opportunity that we're working toward right now in terms of updating our CMS and trying to rebuild a better digital platform. But the Sun in particular, helped us get something that had a lot fewer entry points than things that had been set up previously. So that's kind of where we see that. And plus, I talk with Larry and with Dana Caulfield, the editor, often, just in terms of what can we be, if they're working on a story, we are kind of aware of it. If there's a story that we have that I think would be of interest to them, or our editors think would be of interest to them, we try to make sure that they recognize that it's there, and so that they can, pick that up and put that on their site. And then, of course, help drive traffic to Colorado Community Media.
Just for the benefit of our listeners, Larry is Larry Rickman, who's the editor of the Colorado Sun, and Dana Caulfield is, she's the number 2 editor. I think her title is
she's a senior editor, yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Linda, in February, one of your papers, The Golden Transcript, took a deep dive into its past coverage of race and actually published an apology. In particular, the transcript singled out its coverage of the Black Panther Party for focusing on the anti-Panther hysteria that was prevalent in the late 1960s and early 1970s. That coverage ignored the party's work in the community on things like free breakfast programs for kids and other good works. You wrote, quote, "Our predominantly white newsroom was tasked with scrutinizing the tainted coverage that came decades before and working out how to repair the relationship with Black readers today. Many who distrust traditional forms of media because of past biases like the ones we detailed in the project." As your paper also reported, many of the articles in question were wire stories of the sort that most papers in the country probably ran. So here's a 2-part question. How did this project come about, number one? And do you see it as a challenge to other news organizations that also unquestioningly publish those same wire stories?
First of all, the issue came about, it was all kind of serendipitous. So the one of the projects that I was involved with was the Colorado Media Project did this Voices Project is what they called it. And the Voices Project was, they got various groups they had Black Voices Project, they had the Latinx Voices Project, they had the AAPI Project, Indigenous Voices, I believe also LGBT. So they worked with many different groups. And essentially, the primary question for that is that we recognize, at the Colorado Media Project level, we've pulled together funders, we've pulled together community people, we've pulled together media from all these different groups. And they said, we recognize that there's a lack of trust between one group and another. What are the things that we can do to help build that trust? And so I participated in the Latinx project, and I listened in. I sat in with a number of the other projects just because, of course, I've made it a priority at CCM that we need to be more reflective and responsive to all of our communities. And so that was something that was really important to me. So when I sat in actually in the Black Voices Project before I even came to CCM. And essentially what it came down to is they said, there was harm done in terms of how coverage happened for a number of these media organizations, and that we need them to acknowledge harm. And I'd have to say that one kind of, it struck me by surprise, because I'm like, there's all these things in terms of representation, in terms of getting hiring, and there's diversity and all this kind of stuff like that. But why is harm so important? And they said that's, it's the foundation, is that if we can't trust that you understand, here's what happened to us in our past and how it colored everything about our culture today, then anything that you try to do today is going to fail. And so, it kind of comes from a mindset of restorative justice. And it was interesting to hear that. And so I'm thinking about all of this when I sat in on a presentation by a research librarian named Jamaica Lewis. And she was doing a presentation at the Denver Press Club about the Black Panther Press, which they had received at the Blair Caldwell African American Research Library here in Denver. They had received a number of original copies of the Black Panther Press, which was a newspaper that the group put out in the 70s. So she was, during her presentation, putting up, here's the context in which these papers are getting out for the community. And so she's showing a number of archival headlines at the time from other mainstream media organizations. And, 75% of them were from the Golden Transcript, and 75% of them were negative in terms of what was happening there. It was about it's a golden paper. So you think, okay, golden news is what you would expect to be in the golden paper. They were daily at that point. And that essentially it was, a United Press International story about the Black Panthers, weapons cache found in Denver, murder trial in back east, in Chicago. And so there's a lot of those kinds of types of stories. And then some from columnists that were either UPI or other or even internal that were just like thugs, militants, a lot of that kind of language being used. And, never talking about the community. And of course, when you talk about Golden in particular, it's a community that has a fairly strong history of, back in the 20s of Klan membership, of, the crosses being burned on nearby South Table Mountain. And so there's kind of like this, where's the chicken and egg in that? And so that's kind of some of so I'm listening to these two different things, and I'm thinking, well, here's an opportunity for us to figure out how we can acknowledge harm, which is to meet with that Colorado Press or Colorado Media Project. And so I put in a grant that they were looking for. And so that grant helped me pay for hiring Jamaica Lewis as a researcher, hiring another researcher from the University of Colorado, a doctorate student in political science, and then having folks on our staff be able to dedicate some time to, researching this project and putting it in place. It took a long time. Partly it's, in the finding of people, partly it's that our newsroom was working on another project related to affordable housing, which is a huge crisis here in Denver right now. And so those two projects. We kind of just kept saying, okay, well, what are the ways that we can work on this? And what are the ways that we can make sure that we're including those voices that need to be included in it? And I had asked a mentor of mine, and who actually was on your podcast interview a couple months ago, Gregory Moore.
Yes.
He was my boss at the Denver Post, and I respect him so much, and he lives in Golden actually. And so I asked if he would want to participate in that. And so he was involved in a couple of the early meetings. And then once our story had been through a number of edits on our side, I asked if he would take a look and edit it and, help us as well. Just trying to make sure that I'm doing everything I can to make sure that the story is inclusive and that we understand, kind of like here are the points of what is going on. So I was really pleased and by the output that we had there, and plus the reaction that we got from both folks in the Golden community and around the metro area, where people understood what we were trying to do. And I think that one of the things that, in terms of you talk about challenge, there are a number of news organizations who have similar types of historical stories. I think it's just, it is finding ways to talk about that history, which is uncomfortable for us, I think is something that we need to do often, just to make sure that people understand that this is, it's funny because we always, every once in a while as observers, we try to make sure that we're outside of that. We're just on the outside of it, but no, as a community voice, we are part of that. And we need to give ourselves that same level of scrutiny as we do to any group that we cover.
Linda, you've also told me that you were hoping to use your position as a visible Latina leader to encourage more diversity in journalism. Now, we've talked with other news leaders about the lack of diversity in newsrooms, including Greg Moore, who you just mentioned a moment ago, and our Northeastern colleague Meredith Clark, who shut down the newsroom diversity survey she was running for the News Leaders Association after most media organizations declined to participate, and some editors responded to her with hostility. So I'd like to ask you to talk about the importance of diversity in newsrooms and tell us what steps you've taken to diversify the staff of Colorado Community Media.
Even when I was at the Post, I had a lot of difficulty trying to reach the audiences that I wanted to make sure were seeing our job postings, and that we were doing the things that we needed to do in order to broaden the folks who were seeing our job posts, and so therefore would apply to our job posts. And that's usually the problem that you're coming to when you're talking about trying to increase diversity, is that it's like, who is seeing this post? Who is seeing this? And so, since then, I spend so much time just like reaching out to folks that I know, of saying, who in your community is looking for work? It's one of the things that I hate Twitter for 95% of what happens on Twitter. But one of the things that I've really tried to do is curate a very large journalism community. And so I'm sharing job postings and, hey, we're hiring, and putting up LinkedIn posts and saying, ask me about, and a lot of those kinds of things. And I found that has really helped more folks see the fact that we're hiring, and, pulling in everything that we can. I think it's a very, when I talk about slow processes, that is probably the slowest one that we deal with. Just in terms of trying to find that, that balance. But you do get to a point where you just kind of say, look, I understand that we have a real issue if we're not hearing what 30% of our community is caring about. And we have to do better. We have to find ways to, whether it's saying, we require that this position be someone who's bilingual, whether it's, it's saying we need to make sure that this person is from the community that they're covering, which, given the affordability issue that I mentioned earlier in the Denver market, that's sometimes hard to do. We're in a number of suburban communities where the median house is $750,000. And that's the kind of thing where it's like, okay, there's not going to be somebody who is living in that community. So, okay, if they're not living in that community, how are they going to learn about what's going on there? And so it's a really deep question, and especially for a community newspaper that, as much as I continue to try, we're never going to be able to pay what the big guys pay. And so therefore I'm, coming to a reporting class that essentially needs a lot of training. What I try to do is I tell them, look, you're going to get the best training that we can offer, and that you're going to learn how to do everything, and you're going to be so marketable that you're going to get hired for that higher salary at some point, in a couple of years. And that's kind of my goal in terms of what we do as an organization. I know that, and always, trying to find ways to make what we do, make our reporters pay for, or, get our reporters' salaries up to where they need to be, will also help find more people able to take on that responsibility. I started an internship program as well, a paid internship program. It's not, no one's going to get rich doing it, but certainly, it's an opportunity for people to get in the door and to see what good we're doing, and to then, improve their skills. And in both cases, our interns this last summer, I would have, one of them we hired, and the other one, was immediately hired by somebody else, even though I tried to hire him too. So, that's the best way that you can do it, is you say, I'm going to offer you every opportunity. And so to make sure that job post is getting in front of many groups of people. And I share it with, friends and associates that I've made, in many different, from many different demographics, from military veterans to, people of color, to LGBT, to, all of those. There's so many different ways to thread the diversity needle, which sounds horribly, practical. I don't know, hackneyed really is what it comes down to, but it's still a way that I try to think about, like, what's going to give us the best opportunity to tell the stories from all of our, of this great fabric that we have of people. So that's what I'm trying to do. It's very slow though.
It's really great. I want to pivot to kind of a nuts and bolts question. So in your job as managing editor of the Denver Post, it seems like you had to do a little bit of everything, from managing the daily news cycle to making budget decisions. I imagine that being publisher of CCM and building out a news operation involves a lot of multitasking as well. So can you take us through a typical day in your life as publisher, if there is one?
It was one of the reasons why, when I was first starting out in this business, that I really loved journalism, because I was a big fan of the mile wide and inch deep. That, as a I started as a copy editor, and so therefore I had to know a little bit about everything. And I loved being able to know like that whole process. I mean, I always think sometimes, I mean, you know, I came up as an editor and not a reporter. And so therefore I would get like, you know, I would do tours of the newsrooms and I would tell people, here's what this department does. And, oh, yeah, I did that for a little while. And then, oh, here's what this department does. And, oh, I did that for a little while, too. And so, you know, having that kind of experience where you know, I worked with the pressman on fixing our page flow so that not all the pages ended up at once. And so that was the kind of thing I was doing then. And I've found that being a publisher, I need to stop doing that so much, but making sure that everybody else knows how to do that and can just, you know, watch them more. I am horrible at that. You know, we talk about, you know, I went through the Pointer Media Transformation Challenge, and it's called being on the dance floor versus being in the balcony. And I am such a dance floor person. You know, there's a constant, you know, beat going on in my head about like, okay, I can go in and I can make this newsletter and I can do this and I can do that. And it's like, okay, I can't do that as a publisher, but I do spend a lot of time talking about here's what I want. So, you know, I don't really have a typical day. But I try to make sure that I'm meeting with all of my senior staff, everybody who runs the department, digital, advertising, editorial, you know, production, that I'm meeting with them every week to try and figure out what their problems are. And, you know, one of the questions that I ask all of my senior leaders at some point is, how can I help you? What can I do to help, you know, clear away some obstacle that is stopping you from doing your best work? And so I spend a lot of time doing that, you know, and obviously coming from a newsroom, I probably, you know, obsess a lot more about like the things in the newsroom that we could be doing better. And that it's like, hey, you know, are we paying attention to this breaking story? Or I'm looking at the site and saying, you know, we had an unfortunate case of a octogenarian who was accused of killing his family members because of housing issues. He was worried about being homeless, and I'm not exactly sure how that all worked out. But in any case, it's a very tragic story. But, you know, the fact that we don't have axe murder in the headline is the thing that is going to, you know, get people to pay attention to that story online are the kinds of things where I feel like I can, you know, impart a little bit of that wisdom that I have in terms of having been an editor. I, you know, spend a lot of time, like, you know, especially as we are starting through this digital transformation of like trying to figure out where are the places where I need to be improving ourselves foundationally. Like, hey, you know, how are we setting this up for this digital audience? How are we, you know, and so I spend a lot of time with that. And then obviously, you know, I spend a lot of time looking at our financial situations and really paying attention to the fact that, you know, printing costs have, you know, just skyrocketed in the last couple of years. That, you know, the price of newsprint, the price of, you know, fuel for distribution and delivery and for postage has just, you know, that sort of stuff is stuff that I never had to pay attention to before. And so I'm very slowly learning that and trying to see what I can do to help find new ways to approach some of those issues. So that's kind of, but, you know, there's a lot more talking, which suits me just fine. But I joke to people that if I'd have known that being a publisher was so much fun, I would have done that first. But, you know.
Well, that seems like a good spot to close with the question that we ask all of our guests. What's on your media diet? What do you read, watch, or listen to? And how do you keep up with what's going on in Colorado?
Well, I am a voracious media consumer. And it's something that was asked of me a long time ago, is that I try to make sure that diet is large and varied. I live in the north part of the metro area, and the office for Colorado Community Media is in the south part of the metro area. So I am traversing the highways nearly every day. And so I listen to a ton of podcasts because that's just the best way that I can get, the news of the day, the news of where we are, and then also stuff that I'm interested in. I recognize I'm a giant history nerd, and so I listen to a lot of historical podcasts, and I then pepper in usually like journalism podcasts like this one. Locally, Colorado Public Radio is, constantly on my radio. There's a great podcast group called CityCast that does CityCast Denver. That's manned by a couple of folks who are local, who are just, they're exactly what you want to see from a local news podcast. They do stories that are interesting, that are of, local interest. I'm kind of a politics nerd, and so they do a lot of politics stuff. And they always find guests that are not the normal people that you expect. So it's not the same voices. It's not the same people. It's like, somebody who was homeless, who managed to turn their life around, and they are, distributing, stories through this method. And they're just doing some really interesting things. And I feel like I learn a lot every time I listen to them, and they just have a really good pulse of what's going on in Denver. And then, of course, I read the Denver Post every day. I get, as I said, we're trying to build up our newsletters. So I probably get, 50 newsletters a day from places all around the metro area. And I either look at them or glance at the headlines and delete them. But for the most part, every single one. But yeah, that's my diet is, I eat all the time on media.
That's quite a media diet, I have to say. Anyway, thank you so much, Linda, for coming on to the podcast. We've been talking with Linday Shapley, publisher of the Colorado Community Media newspapers and websites.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. I love talking to you guys, and I love listening to your podcast.
Well, thank you so much. That's very nice of you. And I so enjoyed my week in Denver. I'd love to come back at some point.
Thank you, Linda. Dan, I was really interested in Linda's newsletter strategy. She's putting out regional newsletters, and in a state as varied as Colorado, that seems very smart.
Yeah, it really does. And I think that what we have found, here we are, 25 years into the internet, it turns out that email is the killer app.
I know.
It's hard to distribute your work electronically any other way. And as we're seeing with the current meltdown of Twitter,
right.
Social media was actually never a very good way to distribute our content. And now it's getting even more dubious.
Email is indeed a way around the platforms, and people have been using it for a long time, are very used to it. You can scroll through your phone, hit the highlights in the morning. I love newsletters. She is very wisely, I think, trying to focus on increasing her penetration. I think she mentioned it's a little over 1%, and her goal is 10 to 15%. That seems really admirable.
It seems like a really smart strategy. A few years ago, I interviewed Jerry and Ann Healy, who were the couple who owned Colorado Community Media before the deal was brokered by the National Trust for Local News. And I remember Jerry and Ann telling me that they wanted to do more in digital, and their advertisers didn't particularly want to deal with digital. They said, we contacted you because we want to buy print ads. So I think Linda has a culture challenge to deal with as well.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, we've been off for quite a while, Ellen.
Forever.
And we've been off because you've been doing something pretty exciting. So can you tell us about it?
Well, during the pandemic, and actually before the pandemic, I was studying remotely to get a master's of science in the philosophy of science and religion. I started it in 2016. I wanted a distraction from the election coverage. And boy, was it ever a distraction. Philosophical writing is very different than journalistic writing. But I stuck with it, and I was actually hoping to go to the University of Edinburgh in the summer of 2020 to work on my master's thesis. We all know that didn't happen. It was the pandemic lockdown. Finally, in March of 2023, the university held an in-person graduation. So I had my gown, my hood, and I walked in this stately ceremony in McEwen Hall in Edinburgh. They had a piper and a drummer pipe us in. It was awesome.
It sounds wonderful. And even better, now that you have a master's of theology, you can become one of my spiritual advisors.
I that's one of my goals in life, Dan.
Now, I understand that when you told people that you were working on a book about the future of local news, you were mobbed. So tell us about that.
So interesting that it's on people's minds in the UK. So my wife, Ellen Zucker, gave a talk. She's an attorney. She gave a talk on high-profile American trials at Oxford. And I was listening in. I was there. It was a Sunday brunch sort of setting. And when it came out that I was a journalist working on the book we've been writing, people gathered around me and said the same thing is happening in the UK, in their towns. The local newspaper has shut down or been cut to shreds, and they miss knowing what's going on. They're desperate for information, and they're very unhappy, and they want to know what possible solutions are.
Well, I guess they'll have to read our book when it comes out. It will be called What Works in Community News, and it's scheduled to be published by Beacon Press in April of 2024.
Yeah, and these were largely attorneys and judges and students. They're news consumers. They really care, and they see a huge gap.
It's a problem everywhere. I think that we're slowly beginning to take some steps towards solving it, and I hope they can do it in the UK as well.
Well, it's great to be back.
It's great to have you back. Today, we'd like to welcome Madison Zagareras, who's one of our graduate students here at Northeastern School of Journalism. Madison recently wrote a story about Kefi FM, a Boston-based online radio station that streams programming of interest to the Greek and Greek American communities, including a lot of music featuring the latest Greek hits. As Madison writes, local radio plays an important role to those people by providing a unique public service that reinforces a sense of belonging and community. So welcome, Madison.
Hello.
Hi, Madison. Thanks for joining us. How did you discover Kefi FM?
I was at a Greek event in the area at the Greek consulate in Boston, actually, and I was speaking to a few of the attendees, and I mentioned I was Greek and that I'm the president of Northeastern Hellenic Society, and she said, "Oh my goodness, you have to meet this woman, Maria." And Maria works at Kefi FM. She volunteers her time, and she introduced me to one of the founders, Christos, or Chris, and he's actually a Northeastern alumnus. So we got to meet from there.
And where can I find it on the dial?
You can find it actually on their streaming service through their website, or you can stream it through their app, Cafe FM.
Where's the web address if you go look for it on the web?
I think it's just www.kefifm.
That's KEFIFM.
Yes.
.com?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, terrific. Now, other than playing music, how does Cafe FM serve its listeners? I know you wrote that it has close ties to a number of businesses in the Greek American community. You mentioned an events calendar as well.
Yes, Cafe FM is very dedicated to the community and to their listeners. And especially after COVID, they wanted to give back to the businesses who help support them. So they have a Cafe Hub where local Greek businesses can submit their business and promote it through the website with an address, a phone number, as well as their calendar, where any person in the New England area can submit an event that they would like to promote via the website. That will also be announced on the air.
Now, once you're streaming, you're national, you're worldwide, but it does sound like they're seeking to serve the Greek American community in Boston and New England.
Yes, they do a lot of work for the local community, but they have listeners everywhere. They've had people listen to their radio in Greece, actually. But they do have a lot of focus on supporting their local businesses in Boston.
Is it multilingual?
Yes, they have different programs. Some will be in English or some will be in Greek, and they have Greek jingles. So to mimic the ones you might hear on the air in Greece, they mimic that as well.
And Madison, you mentioned a Greek-oriented program on an over-the-air AM station as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, there's a program called Grecian Echoes. They are also a Greek radio, and I spoke to one of their hosts who hosts a show about Greek music and educating their listeners on the history of music as well as new artists.
And by the way, for those of our listeners who are local, that is on WNTN AM 1550. So if you're listening to us in the Boston area, you can tune that in. So anyway, thank you so much, Madison. You can read Madison's story on the What Works website at whatworks.news. It's a terrific piece of work. I'm so glad you were able to come in and talk to us about it.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Madison.
Ellen, 5 years ago this month, something remarkable happened. Chuck Plunkett, then the editorial page editor of the Denver Post, wrote an editorial that led the front page of the paper, calling on the paper's hedge fund owner, Alden Global Capital, to sell the Post to people in the community who actually cared about news coverage. He wrote, "If Alden isn't willing to do good journalism here, it should sell the Post to owners who will." The editorial was accompanied by a number of commentaries, including one written by former Post editor Greg Moore, who, as we've already mentioned, was a recent guest here on What Works. As Plunkett noted, at one time the Post had employed 300 full-time journalists. By April of 2018, that number was down to 100, and Alden was getting ready to cut it to about 60, where it remains today. Well, Alden didn't sell. Plunkett ended up leaving, and today he's a professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. But the fallout wasn't all bad for Denver journalism. 10 other top Post journalists left to start a digital publication, the Colorado Sun. Recently, Plunkett wrote a piece for the Sun reflecting on the rebellion and what it wrought. As he pointed out, despite all the cuts, the Post continues to do good work. The Sun has established itself as a crucial source of coverage for both Denver and the state. Colorado Public Radio and a digital outlet it acquired, Denverite, now comprise what may be the largest newsroom in Colorado. And there's even a startup daily newspaper, the Denver Gazette, that publishes what looks like a print product on its website and that does a lot of investigative work. As Plunkett wrote in the Colorado Sun, so much new talent has bubbled up around us as a result that it's difficult to keep track.
So, Dan, based on our conversation with Linda, it seems like Denver's suburbs are getting pretty good coverage. What about the rest of the state?
Well, that's been a problem. In fact, one of the reasons that the Colorado Sun does some statewide reporting is that they're trying to provide coverage in rural areas that are truly news deserts. But there's been at least a little bit of good news on that front as well. Corey Hutchins of Colorado College, who writes an indispensable newsletter on Colorado media, reports that a group of papers several hours southwest of Denver were recently acquired by a small chain in Arizona called the O'Rourke Media Group. The CEO, Jim O'Rourke, told Hutchins, "I feel like I'm taking over newsrooms that are well-resourced." Now, we know that at least for the immediate future, we're probably going to continue to lose more local news outlets than we gained. But we didn't get into this problem overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight. At some point, I think we're going to gain traction, and we're going to start seeing some real solutions to the crisis in community journalism. And that will come from people on the ground who are willing to do the work.
Well, speaking of people on the ground who are willing to do the work, I just read an article in Neiman Reports, and I'm here to tell you that old journalists just don't retire. They launch nonprofit newsrooms.
Or make podcasts.
Or that, indeed. John Marcus has a great piece that looks at some inspiring news projects launched by journalists who are in their 70s and 80s. Two examples are close to home here in Massachusetts. Barbara Rossner, a retired managing editor of the Hartford Courant, is editor of the New Bedford Light, a startup in New Bedford, the old whaling city on the south coast of our state. The Light was launched after the Gannett-owned paper, the Standard Times, was decimated by cutbacks. There are other retirees advising the Light, including Walter Robinson, the legendary former editor of the Boston Globe Spotlight team. Robbie, as he's known, is 77, but he recently told me he's also advising a startup in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where he lives. And Ed Bell, the 82-year-old retired AP Boston bureau chief, co-founded the Marblehead Courant, which was launched last year after Gannett pivoted to generic regional coverage in the local weekly.
What's driving this other than boredom or a hatred of pickleball, which I can certainly understand?
Right. It's a wish to give back to their communities, and there's also despair at the wreckage caused by chain consolidation, the collapse of the ad-centric business model, and corporate greed, all of which we've talked about on this podcast. According to Pew Research Center, newsroom employment has dropped tremendously since the Great Recession of 2008, from 114,000 to 85,000 journalists. The pandemic years haven't been kind to newsrooms either. We've seen cuts at the Washington Post, NBC News, Vox Media, and NPR. Dan, you'll remember that Lincoln Milstein, a retired Hearst journalist who started the Quiet Side Journal in Maine, appeared on this podcast last year. He told us there are more retired journalists in the United States than working journalists. Indeed, the Pew survey found that many working journalists are near retirement. About a quarter of the journalists who remain in newsrooms are 55 and older. The good news, there's a lot of collective brainpower out there.
It is good news indeed, and what we can hope is that these retirees will pave the way for jobs for younger journalists over the next few years as they build up some of these digital startups.
Thank you for listening to the Local News Matters podcast, and thanks to Dan Kennedy and Ellen Clegg for this enlightening conversation and for permission to drop it here. Thanks to Linday Shapley and everyone at Colorado Community Media for all of the work that you do. A final thanks to our production partners at Pirate Audio. Pirate Audio believes every community deserves great things to listen to, and they are on a mission to help local newsrooms reach their communities via audio. If you're interested in starting a podcast or need production support for an existing one, let me know and I'd be happy to connect you. If you like this episode and what we're doing more generally, please follow in your favorite podcast app. Leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. I appreciate the support. You can find past episodes, full transcripts, and relevant links, and sign up for our newsletter at localnewsmatterspodcast.com or for lazy typists like me at lnmpod.com. You can also follow us on most social media channels at lnmpod. If you have recommendations of others doing interesting and innovative work in local news, let me know through the contact form at the website lnmpod.com.